Welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm Dr. Otis Fulton, Vice President for Psychological Strategy at Turnkey. I'm here to help you understand the language of the Turnkey for Good community, how we talk to each other. It's called Gestalt Language Protocol. Gestalt is a communication process that emphasizes sharing one's experience instead of giving advice. Using this process increases the amount and accuracy of information we share while building strong positive bonds between people. For our on-site events called convenings and for our virtual groups called alongside groups, we actually require that conversations happen this way. You can get more information about how to access convenings and alongside groups on our website in the community section. Gestalt, hey, here's how it works. It's happened to most all of us. We've given someone advice that's perfect for their situation, but they didn't follow it or even seem interested in it. What's up with that? If you're in a leadership position in your organization, you probably think of yourself as a fixer. As in, when someone comes to you with a problem, it's your job to fix it. So because we're fixers, we often think we need to should on people who come to us with problems. As in, you should try this, you should ask Mary, she knows the answer, or you should start over from scratch. Psychologists have learned what a difficult word should is for us to hear. People unconsciously recoil from should because it takes away their sense of autonomy. The result is what psychologists call reactance. It pushes us in the opposite direction. Tell your 14-year-old they should keep their room straighter, and they'll wind up liking it messy even more. Reactance happens unconsciously whether you're 14, 44, or 84. Usually when someone has a problem, what they're really looking for isn't someone to solve it. What they want is to understand the problem better so they can figure out their own solution. They're stuck. When they're ready to move forward, they want to do it their own way, not your way. When you or I should on them, we skip over their understanding of what's happening and why and push them to move forward with our solution. People want help, but don't want to be told what to do. So it's difficult to fully understand what happened and why, but we can listen to the person and ask clarifying questions. Questions like, how long has this been happening? Do others on your team feel the same way as you do? Do you have the power to make the kind of changes that you want? How does this affect the operation of the organization as a whole? After you ask these kinds of clarifying questions, what comes next? Instead of sharing advice, share an experience that you think is relevant to the person's problem. What's the difference between sharing our experience and our advice? A lot. Advice is directive towards a solution. It tends to shut down discussion and force a judgment. Sharing your experience without advice can broaden a person's perspective on their problem. It helps them to think critically. Advice is a summary recommendation of what we think someone should do. We want to be helpful, but we can easily end up disempowering the other person. So here's the problem with advice: 4 things. First is it's easy to demean others without meaning to. When you share advice, you're saying that you don't think they were smart enough to consider this approach. Second is the "you're not the boss of me" idea. Advising is telling someone what to do. It's easy to trigger reactance and cause people to miss the value in your recommendation. Third is advice jumps past critical thinking. Advice is delivered in the form of solutions, not a critical thinking process. The critical thinking process is more important than any one particular solution. And last, advice forces a response. Giving advice jumps to a conclusion. The other person has to say yes or no to your advice. The conversation shifts from my problem to the validity of your solution. So your experience is different from your advice. Sharing your experience isn't always easy, but when you do it right, it can broaden the other person's perspective. So here are a few examples of what sharing your experiences sounds like. When our organization faced a sudden drop in donations, we reached out to our community with personal stories from those we've helped. The direct impact of their contributions brought a surge of renewed support and engagement. Another one, I've learned that transparent communication during our volunteer training sessions leads to more effective service. Sharing the real challenges we encounter along with the successes prepares them better for the work that we do. Finally, one of the most impactful strategies I've implemented in our outreach programs was to create a space for beneficiaries to share their experiences with new participants. It fostered a sense of community and trust that I couldn't have built on my own. So your experience is a real-world example. It can broaden the conversation rather than limit it, as advice often does. Sharing your experience when you do it well will do 4 things. It'll provide a real-world example. It's like a case study about one approach and outcome. Second, it adds without trying to control. Your experience becomes one of many pieces of information in the conversation. You're not trying to direct the other person just to your solution. Third, it acknowledges the uniqueness of the other person. Advice says you should do this and do it this way. Experience is, I did it this way, but I'm not you, and my situation was not exactly like yours. And last, your experience can become a discussion point to increase perspective. So finally, after sharing your experience, resist the temptation to wrap a bow around it. Don't finish by saying something like, hey, the moral of the story is hire an outside auditor, or whatever your story involved. That's advice. Instead, use questions to direct the focus back to the other person's situation. You might ask a question like, hey, so did anything pop into your mind about your situation listening to what happened to me? Or did anything about what I said strike you as being relevant to your experience? Your experience is valuable to the extent it stimulates reflection in the other person. So keep the conversation about their situation, not about your experience. Instead, use your experience as a touch point to ask the person to reflect more deeply on their own situation. That's it. We use Gestalt at Turnkey because it results in more information shared and builds better relationship. I hope you'll give it a try.